Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film, as we now look at important events in the French and Indian War that took place during or after the movie, The Last of the Mohicans. And as you saw in the movie, following a long siege at Fort William Henry, the British felt forced to surrender. They were given very generous terms, allowed to march out with their regimental flags, their personal possessions, and promised safe passage down the road to Fort Edward. But some of the French's Indian allies resented not being able to plunder the British troops, as one reason for going to war was to loot whatever you could from captured enemies. And to the day after their surrender, on the road to Fort Edward, the British troops were attacked by Montcalm's Indian allies. At least 700 British soldiers and militiamen were killed or wounded or went missing. Those who were killed or wounded were often knocked in the head with tomahawks and war clubs or scalped. Although many did survive and make it to Fort Edward, and Colonel Monroe himself was not killed in the massacre as shown in the movie. He survived but died 3 months later, falling over dead on the streets of Albany from apoplexy, as they put it at the time, which was probably a heart attack but could have been a stroke or an aneurysm. It's hard to say for sure. So, 1757 ended badly for the British, but under William Pitt's leadership, things began to change, as he planned a three-pronged attack on New France for 1758. Louisburg, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, would be taken, just as it had been 13 years before by New England militia. Fort Carillon, which the British called Fort Ticonderoga, at the southern end of Lake Champlain, would be captured, letting British forces move up Lake Champlain into Canada. Another British army would march down Braddock's Road to Fort Duquesne. But this time, instead of sending 2 regiments to America and raising local militia, Pitt called for 20,000 regulars to be sent to America, 22,000 American militia to be raised. And he had another advantage that he may not have even known he had. New France was starving due to its relatively few farms, its short and poor growing season, and diminishing support from France, which was focusing on fighting going on in Europe. In the first stage of this strategy was the attack on Fort Louisburg. Not only did the British, especially New England colonists, resent its return at the end of King George's War, but it was a constant threat to British shipping and possibly even the colonies themselves. And of course, if the British could seize control of this fortress, the Royal Navy could cut off all French shipping down the St. Lawrence River, further starving Canada, and perhaps sail up the St. Lawrence themselves to invade the heart of Canada. And so, in June of 1758, about 12,000 British soldiers under the command of Geoffrey Amherst arrived on Cape Breton Island. The first wave of British boats to land on the shore was led by General James Wolfe, a very daring commander who led his men through the dangerous surf. Afterwards, some men said he was mad. King George said, "If he is mad, I wish he'd bite more of my generals." And while Louisburg was an impressive fortification, the British outnumbered the French. There were 12,000 British soldiers compared to 7,000 French defenders of the fort, and soon the French ran out of food and were forced to surrender on July 26, 1758. And from here, Fort Louisburg would serve as a major point to stage attacks up the St. Lawrence River. Now, to secure Lake Champlain, Pitt sent the army against Fort Carillon, or again, Ticonderoga, the southern end of Lake Champlain. He sent about 6,000 British soldiers, along with somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 militia and Indians. The French forces there were commanded by the Marquis de Montcalm. By now, he was down to just about 3,600 regulars, militia, and Indians, and low supplies. The French dug earthworks in the rough ground outside their fort and built a bâtisse, which were kind of long wooden poles, kind of like a telephone pole, with longer sharpened stakes stuck through them, kind of to take the role of barbed wire or the hedgehogs you can see in World War II the large obstacles made of steel beams welded together, and put these out in front of the fort. Even so, the British might have approached the fort from other angles or simply waited for the French to run out of food, but instead Abercromby sent his men directly against the French lines across the only open field between them and the French. Most of them were shot dead before they even got there, making great targets there on the grass. Those who got close to it got stuck in the abatis and were shot as they tried to get through. Some were even pressed onto the abatis and impaled by British soldiers behind them, pushing them forward. The very few who got to the French earthworks were bayoneted trying to get over them. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed, over 1,500 wounded. In contrast, only 100 Frenchmen were killed, around 500 wounded. And with over 3,000 men killed or wounded on both sides, this is the bloodiest battle of the French and Indian War, a great victory for the outnumbered, poorly supplied French. Montcalm said, "To whom belongs the victory? Commander, soldier, abatis, behold God's sign, for only he himself hath triumphed here." But the French were low on supplies, and as the British later threatened Quebec and Montreal, Montcalm had to pull most of his men back. And in 1759, the British returned and captured Ticonderoga after all. Now, the third prong in Pitt's plan was an attack on Fort Duquesne, to which he assigned 1,400 regulars and 5,000 militia and Indians under the command of General John Forbes. There's Forbes. I can move around. This is crazy. Okay. All right. Well, that was a bad use of my resources. All right. The British Army under Forbes cut a new road to the forest of Fort Duquesne. He also tried to train his men to fight in the woods and deal with ambushes. And on November 24th, 1758, the outnumbered French surrendered Fort Duquesne, setting it on fire before they left, hoping to deny this important fort to the British. But the British simply rebuilt it and renamed it Fort Pitt, which would later become the basis of the town of Pittsburgh, named for Britain's great leader in the mid-1700s. So, having secured the colonial frontier and cut off the St. Lawrence River with the capture of Louisbourg, the British were ready to strike at the heart of New France, Quebec itself. And the city of Quebec stood on a rocky outcropping where the St. Charles River runs into the St. Lawrence. Three sides of the city were protected by water, the landward side by a massive wall. And in front of those, a field known as the Plains of Abraham, which would expose an army marching across it to constant French fire. And the Plains of Abraham fell down very steep cliffs to the St. Lawrence River, making them almost impossible to reach from the water as well. But in the spring of 1759, the Royal Navy sailed up the St. Lawrence, completely blocked Quebec off from any resupply from Europe. It also brought General James Wolfe and about 9,000 troops, who soon put cannons on the hills across the river from Quebec and began to bombard the city, where Montcalm had about 14,000 soldiers, including militia and Indian allies, although many were not actually in Quebec, but were spread up and down along the St. Lawrence River for about 5 miles east and west, not actually in the city itself. And not knowing for sure where the British might attack, he spread out his forces to be sort of ready anywhere, but turns out not ready enough in certain places. And after many skirmishes around Quebec to keep Montcalm off guard and to test his defenses, Wolfe was ready to attack Quebec City itself September 13th because he had discovered a way up the cliffs from the St. Lawrence River to the Plains of Abraham. And all the cliffs were steep, there was a place they could be climbed, and Wolfe prepared his men to attack the spot. Under the cover of darkness, Wolfe's men floated down the river in little boats where they disembarked 4 a.m. On September 13th. They climbed the cliffs. By the time Montcalm was aware of the attack and convinced it was real, because he wasn't sure at first, Wolfe had over 4,000 men on the plains of Abraham. Montcalm only actually had about 4,500 men in Quebec, although he did send word for men stationed elsewhere to come and reinforce him. And here, Montcalm, I think, probably made a mistake. He might have stayed in Quebec and simply fired from the walls at any British troops marching toward him, but perhaps he felt that would just slow things down. Perhaps he felt he had to make a desperate move. And so, whether or not he should have done so, he ordered an attack, ordered his men out of the gates of Quebec to attack the British on the plains of Abraham. The French regulars and militia marched towards the British, firing as they came. Wolfe was hit on the wrist. The British held their fire until the French were within 60 yards or closer, then all fired at once, stopping the French cold. The British reloaded, fired again, and the French began to run. Wolfe ordered a bayonet charge, and the retreating French shot him twice more, in his chest and his abdomen. Montcalm was also wounded, his leg and abdomen torn apart by cannon fire. At which point, French reinforcements arrived, but seeing they were too late, retreated to safety. Had Montcalm waited for them, he might have surrounded Wolfe and trapped him, but he did not. And the British captured Quebec, capital of New France. Wolfe died on the field of battle, but did survive long enough to hear that the French had surrendered. And is a pretty interesting, indeed famous painting. Wolfe there is dying in the middle, but surrounded by, for the most part, historical figures. Each of them being a specific person and representing a particular unit, either involved in the Battle of Quebec or at least in Wolfe's campaign in Canada. The man in green is interesting from our point of view, he being a member of an American militia force accompanying Wolfe. And of course there we see kneeling, looking at Wolfe in contemplation, an Iroquois warrior, showing us that the British too had Indian allies. The painting, The Death of Wolfe, was so famous that some years later, during the Napoleonic Wars, the great British admiral, Lord Nelson, asked the artist why he had never painted a similar scene, to which the artist said no one had ever given him the inspiration, and Lord Nelson said, "I'll see what I can do." Indeed, his death scene would be the next death scene painted by the same artist. Montcalm died of his wounds the next day. The British lost only 60 men killed, 600 wounded, seizing Quebec. The French, 200 men killed, 1,200 men wounded, and their most important city in New France. And while some battles remained, the war was largely over. Almost exactly a year later, September 8, 1760, Montreal surrendered, as did all of New France, rather than wait for the people there to endure a few more months of starvation as winter approached. And while French Canadians were allowed to keep their homes and continue practicing the Catholic faith, all French soldiers had to return to Europe and promise not to fight again in Europe or America. Some officials back in France were shocked that Montreal had been surrendered without a shot being fired, but King Louis XV, who was more interested in the fighting in Europe anyway, was cheered up by, I believe, the philosopher Voltaire, who said, "After all, sire, what have we lost but a few acres of snow?" Although the French did still hold Louisiana, including forts in what is now Alabama, such as Toulouse and Mobile. They and their Creek allies still threatened the southern colonies and Britain's principal Indian allies in the south, the Cherokee. Now the British had wanted the Cherokee to go north and fight the French for some time, but the Cherokee were afraid if they left their homes, the French or the Creek or someone else might attack them, and so they asked the British to build a fort for them, which the British agreed to do, building Fort Loudoun between 1756 and 1757. This was about 40 miles south of modern-day Knoxville, and although built of wooden palisades, and its design was according to the most modern European theories of defensive engineering. They even hired a prominent military engineer of the time to construct it. But some of the Cherokee who eventually went north to help the British did participate in the capture of Fort Duquesne, but felt their help wasn't appreciated or properly rewarded, and they did not get to loot that many French soldiers, and they went home. Other Cherokee working alongside Virginia militia ended up fighting with them, as many colonial militia didn't trust or like the Indians, and vice versa. Some of the Indians heading home stole some horses in Virginia, saying they were owed something for their help. In response, the Virginians killed 15 other Cherokee in return, figuring one Cherokee is about the same as the other. In return, Cherokee attacked white settlements and killed at least 20 people. And in March of 1760, the Cherokee laid siege to Fort Loudoun, where on August 6, 1760, the British surrendered. The inhabitants, including women who were there to do laundry and cook and whatnot, were promised safe passage back to Virginia or South Carolina. Most of the soldiers there were militia and were allowed to go back home. Indeed, some of them had brought their wives with them, which is why there were women in the fort. They left the fort on the 9th of August and made camp after marching 15 miles. The next morning, though, the Cherokee, still mad at the British and angry that the British had badly damaged the cannons and some other goods they'd left behind, which they had promised not to do, attacked. Again, just at dawn, August 9th. All the officers were killed but one, by the name of John Stewart, a personal friend of one Cherokee chief who paid his ransom. Several private soldiers and some women were killed, although most of the soldiers and women were captured and later ransomed. The British commander, Paul Desmarais, was scalped, forced to dance, beaten with sticks, and finally had his arms and legs chopped off. As he lay dying, they stuffed his mouth with dirt and said, "You English want land, we will give it to you." In response to this and to other Cherokee attacks and even the killing of a number of British officers at a fort in South Carolina, who arguably had it coming, but still, more British soldiers were sent in to slaughter the Cherokee, burn their crops, and force them to sign a peace treaty. The Cherokee did request, as part of their peace treaty, that John Stewart, the only surviving officer of the Fort Loudoun massacre, be made the king's agent to them, and he was. And just 16 years later, would encourage the Cherokee to attack American settlements on the frontier during the Revolutionary War. The Peace of Paris, or Treaty of Paris, ending the war, was officially signed in 1763. And in this, the British gained Canada from France and Florida from Spain. Spain having entered the war on the side of France, their royal families being cousins. They gained as well the eastern part of Louisiana from France, between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, aside from the city of New Orleans on the east bank of the Mississippi, which, along with all of Louisiana west of the Mississippi, was given to Spain by France in exchange for the loss of Spanish Florida. All France retained was 2 tiny islands off the coast of Canada to use as fishing bases. Britain was now master of North America, but as Britain became more involved in the lives of her American colonists, the effects of the war would drive this one great people to become 2 separate peoples.